Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. I found another clip of Bishop Barron just giving a brilliant speech to a group of graduates, a crowd of thousands. And Bishop Barron is explaining the most important decision that we all need to make in our lives. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I'm old, I've already gone over the hump. I don't need to hear this information about the most important decisions of my life. I've already lived those, I've already found those answers. But have you really? I think one of the things that we all need to realize is that we can be inspired by these deep, deep existential questions about meaning, purpose, and ultimately about making great decisions. Whether we're young or old, this speech of Bishop Barron is very practical and very helpful and something that you should listen to and you don't want to miss. Check this out.
Well, it's a permanent honor of this college that it was founded more than 170 years ago by Free Will Baptists committed to the abolition of slavery. Your founders were on the right side of the most compelling moral debate of the 19th century, and it's worth remarking that the leadership of the college today finds itself on the right side of the most pressing ethical argument of our time, namely the protection of the unborn. Frederick Douglass, a former slave who became the most eloquent advocate for abolition in the 19th century, spoke here, as you know, in 1863, just after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. In the course of his lecture, which was entitled Popular Error and Unpopular Truth, he remarked, and I'm quoting, "There's no such thing as new truth. Error might be old or new, but truth is as old as the universe," close quote. At the heart of the curriculum at Hillsdale College is a presentation of those truths, epistemic, moral, and aesthetic, that are indeed as old as the universe. These permanent things that participate in the eternity of God. Now, what I want to do in very brief compass in this commencement address is to examine just one of those truths, the articulation of which occurs over and again in the great Western intellectual tradition. It's accessed typically by means of a question. Not the question of what we are to do, as important as that is, but rather what kind of person we ought to be. Do we hunger and thirst for righteousness, or do we seek our own advantage? In a way, and I'll say it especially to the graduates, there's no question in the moral and spiritual order more fundamental than that. Now, a locus classicus for the entertainment of this question is in Plato's dialogue, the Gorgias. Gorgias and his friends, Polus and Callicles, are sophists, which is to say experts in teaching the art of persuasive speech. Their concern is not being truthful or just, but rather in instructing students how to speak in such a way that they appear truthful and just, and hence become convincing to others. Such professors were, obviously enough, enormously useful to prospective lawyers and politicians in ancient Greece, and it should be equally obvious that their intellectual descendants are rather thick on the ground today. Now, Socrates counters the sophists along these lines. If a rhetorician teaches a politician to do what in fact is unjust, he does that man and his city far more harm than good. But Polus answers by means of a taunt. Wouldn't Socrates leap at the opportunity of having power over life and death? No, says the philosopher in response, for to put someone to death unjustly is in fact no power at all. And it is at this point that Socrates enunciates one of his most enduring teachings, representing a watershed in the moral consciousness of the West. It is better, he says, to suffer wrongdoing than to do wrong oneself. It's better to suffer wrongdoing than to do wrong oneself. At this point, Callicles can no longer restrain himself, giving voice with admirable clarity to a position that endures very much to the present day. The sophist says that what Socrates is calling justice is nothing but the constraints placed on the few strong by the many weak. It's a sort of guilt trip imposed by the powerless to limit the capacity of the powerful to get what they want. If you notice a tight connection between this point of view and the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, you're not wrong. Socrates' argument for his position is simple. Surely suffering injustice is terrible, but what is far worse is the corrosion of soul that takes place when one commits an injustice. In other words, being unjust is far more damaging to the moral structure of one's personality than enduring the slings and arrows visited upon one by the injustice of someone else. So, there's the question, young brothers and sisters, my fellow graduates today. What kind of soul will you have? What kind of person will you be? Will you do whatever it takes to get what you want? Or will you accept even great suffering in order to do what is right? Everything else in your life will flow from how you answer that question. I know that Hillsdale College is committed to the study of the Greco-Roman intellectual tradition, and it's for this reason that I commenced with Plato. But you're also, and above all, committed to the Scriptures. The Bible gets at this very same issue, but it does so not so much through philosophical argumentation as through the prophetic language of idolatry and right worship. For the biblical authors, it's never a question of religion versus secularism. First of all, they were not trading what we call religion. And secondly, they knew that there really is no pure secularism. Rather, they understood that the world is basically divided between those who worship the true God and those who indulge in idolatry or false worship. Even in our supposedly secular society, we can appreciate the appropriateness of the biblical terminology. For everyone, even the most secular, the most unchurched, operates under the aegis of something he or she considers supreme, some summum bonum, some highest good. No one would in fact get out of bed in the morning unless he believed in some value that's ultimately motivating his actions and decisions. Now, this might be bodily pleasure or fame or material goods or one's country or one's family, but if it's functioning as the prime mover of a person's activity, it's playing the role of God and is being effectively worshipped. So, the biblical form of the question that we've been considering is, whom or what do you worship? What's the highest value for you? Again, graduates, everything else in your life will flow from how you answer that question. There are numberless biblical texts that would be ad rem here, but I'd like to look at a particularly clarifying and dramatic one, namely the scene described in the first book of Kings regarding Elijah and the priests of Baal. We recall the setting. Elijah had challenged King Ahab for his worship of false gods proposed by his wife Jezebel. He subsequently challenged the avatars of those deities to a kind of duel on Mount Carmel. Standing alone against the 450 devotees of Baal, he proposed that he and they should erect altars to their respective deities and see who would respond. All morning long, the priests cried out, I'm quoting now from the scripture, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, and there was no answer. At this point, Elijah mocked them. Again, I'm quoting from the scriptures. "Cry aloud. Surely he's a god. Either he's meditating, or he's wandered away, or he's on a journey. Perhaps he's asleep and must be awakened." Close quote. Then, in their frenzy and frustration, the priests of Baal proceeded to cut themselves with swords and lances until the blood gushed over them. But it was to no avail. Then, of course, Elijah calls out to the Lord, and the fire falls, consuming the sacrifice and vindicating the prophet. Now, I want to emphasize, this is much more than simply a jingoistic story of my God's bigger than your God. In point of fact, it's an incomparably rich presentation of the dynamics of true and false worship. The altar erected to Baal should be taken as standing for all the ways in which we order the infinite longing of our hearts to something less than God. When we do this, and fellow sinners in this space, we all know this, when we do this, the fire never falls, because merely worldly things cannot, even in principle, satisfy our hungry souls. And furthermore, when we persist in worshiping falsely, we find ourselves in short order caught in an addictive pattern, hopping, as it were, obsessively around the altars of pleasure or power or fame, desperately seeking a satisfaction that will never come. The self-harm inflicted by the hapless priests of Baal speaks eloquently to the self-destructive quality to which any addict can attest, and all of us sinners are addicts. Only when the fondest desire of our soul is directed to the infinite God will the fire fall and addiction be avoided. So, once again, my young friends, my fellow graduates, the question is simple. At which altar will you worship? Your whole life will unfold, for weal or for woe, from that decision. Now, if we want to see the place where Plato and Elijah come together, we need look no further than the cross of Jesus, which St. Paul described as a divine weakness stronger than human strength, and a divine folly wiser than human wisdom. Where could we find a clearer instantiation of the principle that it's better to suffer injustice than to commit it than in Jesus crucified? Sinless, blameless, he nevertheless took upon himself all the sin of the world. Hatred, cruelty, stupidity, violence, institutional corruption, betrayal, denial, all of it. But rather than lashing out and answering violence, he said, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." Laboring under the full weight of human injustice and wickedness, his soul remained inviolate. And that's why, to the consternation of all the advocates of might makes right, from Callistes to Nietzsche, we hold up the cross and we say, again ironically with Pontius Pilate, "Ecce homo," behold the true man. My intellectual hero, St. Thomas Aquinas, said that if we want to live a happy life, we should love what Jesus loved on the cross and despise what Jesus despised on the cross. Now, what did he despise? But all those objects of false worship to which we tend to erect altars. Many of us worship wealth, but on the cross he was utterly poor, stripped naked. Many of us worship pleasure, but on the cross he was at the limit of suffering, both physical and psychological. Many of us worship power, but on the cross he was nailed in place, unable even to move. Many of us worship honor, but on that terrible cross he was the object of scorn and ridicule. In short, the crucified Lord said no as radically as possible to the idols. And what did he love on the cross? He loved doing the will of his Father. And therefore the cross functioned as the altar on which the sacrifice of his life to the Father took place, and that's why the fire fell. Can I close with a little reflection on my favorite movie, which is Man for All Seasons, that wonderful 1966 film about St. Thomas More, based on Robert Bolt's play of the same name. I probably first saw it when I was about 15, and I've watched it certainly every year of my life since then, showed it to my students over the years. It's shaped my moral thinking in so many ways. More, of course, was a man acquainted both with classical antiquity and a man in love with the Lord Jesus. One of the last scenes of the film depicts the dramatic trial of More under accusation for high treason. Richard Rich, who as a young man had been More's friend and protege, falsely testifies against him, perjuring himself and practically guaranteeing that Moore would receive the penalty of death. As Rich is leaving the courtroom, Moore notices that the younger man is wearing a chain of office. Inquiring of the judges what the symbol at the end of the chain meant, Moore receives the answer, I'm quoting, "Master Rich has been appointed Attorney General for Wales," close quote. Moore grasps the pendant and with a look more pitying than indignant comments, "You know, Richard, it profits a man nothing to give his soul for the whole world, but for Wales." Moore was not so much blaming Rich as noticing with infinite sadness the kind of person he had become, a man with a corroded soul. And it might have been otherwise. In a lesser-known scene from earlier in the film, Moore offers Rich a job as a humble teacher, but Rich, ambitious for glory at the king's court, balks. Moore says, "You could be a good teacher, perhaps even a great one." His protege retorts angrily, "And if I were, who would know it?" The wise Moore patiently responds, "Yourself, your friends, your pupils, God." Not a bad public, that. This exchange actually provides a third way of asking our question. To which audience, finally, are you playing? A lost soul plays to the endlessly fickle audience of the world, hoping thereby to acquire the fleeting goods that the world can provide. The uncorroded soul plays to God and to the friends of God, seeking to please them alone. St. John Paul II, in his writings on the moral life, observed that in every particular ethical choice a person makes, he's doing two things simultaneously. He's performing a moral act with definite consequences, and at the same time, he's making his own character, crafting little by little the person he's becoming. I have the confident hope, graduates, that your years at Hillsdale College have prepared you above all to shape your characters, to become the kind of persons who would endure justice rather than commit injustice, who would never dream of worshiping at the altar of an idol, and who wouldn't surrender the integrity of your souls for the whole world. And if you become the persons God intends you to be, you will succeed in lighting a fire upon the earth. God bless you all. Thank you.